unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. Today is November 5th. It's Election Day in the United States. We're recording this at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time, and polls are gradually opening across the country. All indications point to a statistical dead heat between Democratic nominee Kamala Harris and former Republican President Donald Trump. The outcome will likely turn on tens of thousands of voters in a handful of key swing states. According to leading pollsters and polling aggregators, the race in these states is too close to call. In this hotly contested race, one demographic whose political preferences are much discussed, though less studied, are Indian Americans. A new study, the 2024 Indian American Attitude Survey, tries to fill this gap. The IAAS is a nationally representative online survey conducted by the Carnegie Endowment in conjunction with data and analytics firm YouGov. To discuss the findings of this year's survey, I'm joined by my fellow PIs on the project, Sumitra Badrinathan of American University and Devesh Kapur of Johns Hopkins-SAIS. Devesh, Sumitra, good to be with you.
Thanks, Milan.
Thanks for having us.
Sumitra, let me start with you. We are here today to talk, of course, about how Indian Americans are going to vote, but maybe we should start with just a kind of macro overview of where things stand. So Sumitra, just how would you characterize for those who've been living on planet Mars and not paying attention, what the state of the presidential race is on the morning of Election Day?
I think I'm the only one of the three of us that's actually in DC right now. So I'm just going to start by saying this. I think the mood in DC is really tense. Businesses around me are boarded up. There is plywood covering the walls of windows in restaurants in Northwest DC and near the White House. I also saw in my inbox this morning data from recent polling showing that in 2020, 1 in 5 losing Republicans refused to concede the election. So there's rightfully this sense of fear in the air in DC. That said, I think the funny and maybe one of the greatest parts of this election is that nobody has any clue what's going to happen. Even sort of old-time veteran pollsters are not able to, or are saying that they can't fully predict what's going to happen at the end of counting. I think, though, that Kamala Harris has received some really good polls in this past week, including from Iowa, which is supposedly a red state. So all of that said, I think I want to pre-register my hypothesis, which is I think she's going to win. I think it's going to be close enough for us to feel really uneasy about it. But I think reading between the lines of a lot of analysis and takes that are out there, I think Kamala Harris is favored. But pollsters are afraid to say it because of 2016. I'm feeling cautiously optimistic at this point. Do you share that view?
So, I'd love to hear what Devesh has to say. I have to say that, this has been coined the vibes election, and I think the vibes have been going back and forth in a kind of schizophrenic manner. So I was with you, Sumitra, probably 2 or 3 days ago, and then I made the mistake the last couple of days of opening up newspapers online and reading, every columnist who says, this is my prediction, right? And then you hear what people say about one case or another, and you say, well, actually, maybe I don't know what's happening. Devesh, since Sumitra went out on a limb, what does your inner vibe kind of tell you, if anything?
I have suppressed all my inner vibes.
There could probably be no more Devesh-like statement, I think, uttered.
I just cannot. It's so hard to be confident of making any prediction, and I think that I've felt particularly last because all of us follow elections both in India and in the US. And frankly, in both cases in the last few elections, what we thought, what happened was very different. So I just think that I just don't know, frankly.
So, Devesh, you have been working on India and Indian Americans more specifically for a long time. And many of our listeners will know that 4 years ago, around the same time, we published a report, which was one of the first of its kind, on the political attitudes and preferences of the Indian American community to try and understand how they were looking at the 2020 presidential election. And, the community continues to grow. We see that in terms of its political profile. We also see that in terms of its, demographic heft. But beyond the standard tropes about their size, their growing influence, what do you think makes this community worth considering this election year in 2024?
I think this election cycle stands out for the much greater political prominence of the community because of the number of people of Indian heritage in the presidential campaign. Of course, headed by the Democrat nominee Kamala Harris, whose mother was from India, but also from the Republican side, Nikki Haley, Vivek Ramaswamy, and the Republican vice presidential nominee, J.D. Vance, his spouse, Usha Vance, whose parents were immigrants from India. So it's really very unusual for a community which is otherwise, about 1.5% of the population, of the US population, to have so many of its members at the highest levels of the tickets of both parties.
Sumitra, I want to get into the kind of nuts and bolts of the survey. But before I do that, there has been this question about Kamala Harris, and we'll come back to this later. But, describe for us, if you could, kind of what the competing narratives are about her role in this election vis-a-vis the community.
I mean, there's a bunch of different narratives, and luckily for us, all of those narratives made it into different response options in our survey, so we can put data to this a little bit later as we speak. But the most obvious one for the Indian American community would be that this community is going to vote for Kamala Harris because she's at least partly Indian American. That hypothesis comes from existing political science research that's been conducted in a bunch of different countries around the world, including some data in the United States, where minority communities do tend to vote for people that look like them for a bunch of different reasons, right? They may believe that their own prospects economically, financially will increase. They're just potentially happy to vote for representative candidates that are similar to them in a bunch of different ways. Sometimes they also attribute various personality traits to candidates that come from the same ethnicity as them. So that's pretty common. But then there's also other factors that generally mirror what the entire American electorate thinks about Kamala Harris that we could use as hypotheses. The first is that she is younger than Biden. The second is that she is a woman, and a lot of female voters this time around are very animated by Dobbs and its repercussions, especially in individual states across the U.S. And because of that, women's issues, in particular abortion, are very salient this time around, as we all know. So her identity as a woman could be impacting people. Her identity as a Black woman, along with being Indian American, is also something that could motivate some other people. On policy, we know from existing polling, not necessarily just from our data, but from existing surveys about the American population, that there were some issues on which Democrats were not happy with Biden, and that the nomination of Kamala Harris was reinvigorating the community on certain policy issues, for example, the war in Gaza. So there's a bunch of different hypotheses that could explain why people are motivated, less or more enthusiastic about Kamala Harris's nomination, and at least some of them apply specifically to the Indian American community.
So, Sumitra, let me just stay with you for a second. Let's just jump right into, I think, one of the first of our headline findings, what the survey says about Indian Americans' party identification. Now, we know historically, going back at least until, the middle half of or second half of the 2000s, when we started to get pretty good data on this, Indian Americans have traditionally supported the Democratic Party in overwhelming numbers. Has anything changed in 2024?
So I think you're right. Indian Americans have been amongst the most loyal constituents of the Democratic Party. Our data, which comes, as we've talked before, as Milan mentioned before, is from a survey entitled the Indian American Attitude Survey. We do sample a larger subsection of the Indian American population, including both citizens and non-citizens. But for the purpose of this analysis, we're just going to look at the citizen subsample. That is the subsample that can go to the polls today and cast their vote. So this subsample, which is representative of the entire Indian American population, in line with prior studies and priors generally about Indian American voting behavior, we do find that the Indian American subsample continues to strongly identify with the Democratic Party. To put some numbers onto this, about 47% of Indian Americans say that they consider themselves Democrats, and about 21% consider themselves Republicans. Now, we do have findings from 2020 when we also conducted the same survey 4 years ago. And we can say now that there's actually been a very modest decline in the share of respondents who identify as Democrats. So about 4 years ago, 56% identified as Democrats. That's down to 47% now, which is a slight about 9 percentage point dip. I think in conjunction with that data, though, what's also interesting is that in terms of their political ideology, Indian Americans do skew significantly left of center. A majority of them, about 55%, say that they place themselves on the left side of the ideological spectrum. And I think what's especially interesting about this is that while the party identification numbers show us that there's been this small shift away from the Democrats, the ideology data shows a slightly left shift amongst Indian Americans over time. So essentially, they're self-identifying as liberals at higher rates, yet simultaneously saying that they don't identify with the Democratic Party. And this seeming contradiction could come from a bunch of different reasons, right? So it's important for us, as we're characterizing this community, to underscore that they're not becoming more conservative over time, even if they're not identifying with the Democratic Party in as large a share that they did in 2020.
So, Devesh, I mean, I wonder how you make sense of that, because at first blush, it seems somewhat contradictory that you would have a smaller share of Indian Americans identify overtly as Democrats, but at the same time, a slightly larger share who identify as left of center. I mean, if you put these two data points together, how do you make sense of those?
Well, you can say, Milan, life is full of contradictions. I think, look, I think we were somewhat surprised by the results, given that we thought, given Kamala Harris's Indian heritage, we thought that support for her would be greater than the support for Biden by Indian Americans in 2020. But we see the reverse. In fact, what is surprising, given her Black and Indian heritage, I'm talking of Kamala Harris, that there has also been a decline among Black voters, not just among Indian American voters. The other large minority group, sort of Hispanics, we see a decline there as well. And our prior would have been that a person of color would get greater support from visible minorities and people of color compared to Biden. But actually, we find that the opposite is the case. I think the one thing common to all three groups is the shift, is that where we put the emphasis on ethnicity as the driver for vote choice of people of color, we did not anticipate the degree to which the gender divide and how much that has grown, not just among whites, but among all parts of the US population. And that has been a major factor in this shift in these groups from Biden to Kamala Harris that the vote share has dropped.
I mean, it's interesting because we talked a lot about, how demography is destiny, right? I mean, that was the kind of tagline. And we thought about that in terms of ethnicity and race and the Democratic Party having a kind of perennial majority. But if, in fact, gender, as you were pointing out, and we're going to come to that in a second, has turned out to be, in some sense, just as powerful, right, as race and ethnicity. Sumitra, let me just kind of back up for a second and ask you to maybe just clarify for our listeners or explain to them, the big question, probably the most important question on the survey, which is the one I'm sure our listeners want to hear about, is how Indian Americans will actually vote in the 24 election. You told us a bit about their partisan attachment, a bit about their ideology. What does the survey have to say about their voting intention?
Right. So in 2020, the Indian American community broke about 70-20 in favor of Biden and the Democrats. 4 years later, this year, we estimate it to be closer to 60-30. So in line with what we just discussed about partisanship, the data do suggest a minor shift towards the Republican Party, an 8 to 9 percentage point decrease. It is minor, but it is notable. I will say one other companion data point to go with this is that we ask respondents about how they feel about different political leaders, which is a question which we call the feeling thermometer. And the gap between Democrats and Republicans about how they rate a particular leader can be taken as a measure of polarization. So this year, Democrats give Donald Trump a 24 and Republicans give them a 77, which is a 53-point gap. In 2020, this gap was only 42 points. So I think it's important also to underscore that while there's been this shift, polarization within the Indian American community has definitely grown. And specifically, Democrats are rating Donald Trump worse over time, which might indicate that they've become more locked in about their partisan identity, with Indian American Republicans slightly more unsure. I'd be curious to see whether this minor but notable shift towards the Republican Party trend holds in 2028, because in my opinion, institutionally, the Democratic Party hasn't changed that much over time, but the Republican Party most certainly has. In 2020, Mitch McConnell was still in the picture, Paul Ryan was still in the picture. These people are not there today. And so it's more than just about the policies that the Republican Party is putting out. Institutionally, the structure that they hold and their place in society has changed dramatically since 2020. So we are seeing this shift amongst Republicans. It is not offset by Democrats, Indian American Democrats being unsure. In fact, I would say that their party ID and vote choice has become more locked in than in 2020. And it's this small group of people who are now identifying as Republicans who seem like they've moved away, but I think we have to wait and see whether that trend holds long term.
Hey, Grand Tamasha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grand Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. I mean, one of the things, just to kind of put this in perspective for our listeners, we did in the survey is to just look at comparative data. Comparative data that was collected around the same time that our survey was in the field, that looked at how other ethnic racial groups plan to vote in this election. And what you see there is that, if 61% of Indian Americans plan to vote for Harris, that puts that community roughly in between the Hispanic community and the Black community. So about 58% of Hispanics intend to vote for Kamala Harris. This is according to an Economist YouGov survey carried out simultaneously with ours. While 77%, so a much higher number, of Blacks are reporting that they're going to vote for Harris. Interestingly, Asian Americans, where there was another survey done, the AAPI voter survey, and we'll link to these sources in the show notes, put that number around 64%, right? So Indian Americans are not so far off from what the Asian American average are, although they're kind of at the lower bound. I want to come back just a second to the question of gender, because that was in some ways, one of the second big finding, in addition to this kind of softening or weakening of support for the Democrats. Devesh, for the first time in our community, we are seeing a clear split in how men and women plan to vote. Now, it's true that a majority of both men and women plan to support Harris. Women are much more bullish, much more favorable on Harris than men. And that gender gap we're seeing amongst Indian Americans echoes the gender gap we're seeing across the U.S. electorate. And I wonder if you could just reflect, as a kind of political scientist, as someone who's, lived and worked in the U.S. for a long time, what do you think accounts for this gender gap we're seeing right now in kind of U.S. democracy?
I mean, look, generally people point to sort of anxieties and grievances among males on the one hand, and the much greater salience of the abortion issue after Dobbs for women voters. However, I've not been able to really get a good handle on what exactly are these anxieties and grievances that males have. We have a general sense that especially males who have not gone to college, the jobs that they held, the sort of union jobs, the reasonably well-paying blue-collar jobs have vanished or have declined very sharply, which has contributed to the anxieties. Much greater female empowerment seems to be part of their grievances. But this is all sort of speculated on. What exactly it is, it's hard to really pin down. I think among Indian Americans, what was interesting was, and again, I think it took us by surprise, that this is greater among those born in the US versus immigrants. The prior might have been that immigrants coming, India is a much more patriarchal society. And so immigrants would hold those views, those patriarchal views to a greater extent. Whereas those born in the US would have been socialized here and therefore be less patriarchal. Well, it does seem they have been socialized, but they've been socialized in ways we did not sort of anticipate, which is they've become part of the broader, if you want to call it, mainstream of males that seem to bear these anxieties and grievances, and because of that seem to be gravitating in greater numbers towards Trump. I should add, just one last thing, Milan, there's a few days ago, The Economist had an interesting survey done globally, how people in other countries, how much they support Trump and Harris versus Harris. And India was among, the countries that a slight majority backed Trump. So if that was the case, immigrants should have been more Trump, but actually it's those born in the US that are more Trump. And I'm not quite sure what to make of those contradictions.
So I think that's actually a nice place to segue, because Sumitra, I mean, one of the things that we did when we saw this gender divide was to try to dig in and understand its contours. So we looked at voting intention data disaggregated by gender, disaggregated by age, as well as by citizenship status. That is, are you a U.S.-born citizen or are you a naturalized citizen? Just walk us through, if you could, what the data show when one looks at these, various slices of the data.
Okay. So first off, I'll give the top line numbers on gender. And the way that I think it's interesting to cut this data is to just see the percent of people that say that they're going to vote for Harris as a function of whether they are men or women. So amongst women in our 2024 survey, 67% say they're going to vote for Harris. But amongst men, 53% say they're going to vote for Harris. Now, these are both majorities in both cohorts. So overall, the headline finding is that even for men, more men want to vote for Harris than they do for Trump. But that number is significantly lower than women. And that's the gender gap that is mirrored in other surveys that we've talked about, right? However, if you cut that overall gender subsample even further by age, we see this very interesting and perhaps slightly alarming pattern. If you break the data by those who are under 40 and over 40, and we did it this way because 40 is the median midpoint of our distribution in age, in the under 40 cohort, in 2020, 4 years ago, only 23% said that they would vote for Trump. In 2024, this number is 48%. That is a 25 percentage point increase. That means that the share of young men under 40 saying that they would vote for Trump has doubled in 4 years. Doubled. That is not, those kinds of shifts we rarely see in polling data. And so that's something that's quite notable. I think a couple of other points on gender. It's not that younger women, though, have gotten significantly more liberal over time. For women under 40 as well, there's been a small shift towards Trump and a corresponding decrease towards Harris. It's just that the shift towards Trump amongst men under 40 is so much larger that it's worth underscoring. However, in the over 40 cohort, men are about the same over time in the percentages of them that say that they vote for Trump or Harris. Women over 40 have become slightly more liberal. So I think that's an interesting finding that one part of it mirrors what we know about the U.S. population at large, which is amongst younger men, there is this huge gap. The other part of it doesn't quite mirror the U.S. population, which is that younger women are also slightly moving towards Trump. In terms of naturalized citizens versus those born in the U.S., I think it's important to note that amongst the cohort that's born in the U.S., this cohort also tends to be younger people. So those two variables kind of go together in our sample. So amongst those born in the U.S., we have the surprising finding where the group that is male and born in the U.S. says that they're going to significantly more likely to vote for the Republican Party, which is surprising. And the final point I'll say, because you brought up education earlier and blue-collar jobs, is that the trend that we see in the general American population in the so-called gender election and gender divide is that there's also an educational divide, with people without college degrees being significantly more likely to vote for the Republican Party as opposed to people with college degrees. In our data, we don't find that. We find that people both with and without college degrees break about the same way for both Harris and Trump. So three large points to take away. There is a gender gap. Younger men under 40, the share of them that says that they're voting for Trump has doubled since 2020. There is no educational gap in our data. And then men who are born in the U.S. are also significantly more likely to say that they'll vote for Trump.
So, I think the obvious question that this brings up is, what are the issues that people care about this election year? What is it that's sort of on people's mind as they're going to vote on November 5th, or if they've already voted, as tens of millions of Americans have? Sumitra, tell us a little bit about what the survey says about the kind of issues that are topmost of mind for this demographic of Indian Americans.
Yeah, I think you're right. Issues is probably one way to sort of answer the why behind what's going on. It's probably not the only way. But our survey does ask respondents to rank their top 3 most important issues, policy-wise, that'll influence their vote choice today. So as with the American public at large, it does seem like economic issues loom very large for Indian American respondents. About 17% of them report inflation or price rise as their topmost issue, followed closely by the state of the economy and jobs as their principal concern. And so I think that's interesting because we did say slightly earlier that one of the hypotheses that might push or the arguments for why the Indian American community might be wooed by Kamala Harris is her ethnicity and India-US relations, or the extent to which India factors in people's issues, rank choices, is quite low on the list compared to other issues that most Americans think are important, such as jobs and the economy. The other thing I'll say is that the third most important election issue for the entire Indian American community is abortion. I think that's really interesting because this didn't used to be as salient a concern in 2020. And I think this is welcome news to the Democratic Party, which has the advantage on this issue. And it seems like their messaging is moving people to consider it more seriously. There is a discernible partisan variation, though, on the issues measure, with both Democrats and Republicans emphasizing slightly different priorities. So Republican respondents are much more concerned by the state of the economy, and Democrats in turn are much more motivated by abortion. Broken up by gender, I think, again, it's interesting. Both men and women say that inflation/price rise is the most important issue for them. But women are significantly more likely to say that abortion is important. And that might help us speculate a little bit more about why we have this gender gap as well.
I mean, one of the other things that the survey does is to look at respondents based on their party identification. And for instance, if they respond that they are Republicans or independents, we ask them why they don't, associate themselves with the Democratic Party, and vice versa. If they're Democrats or independents, why they don't associate themselves with the Republican Party. And what's interesting there is that when you look at, why respondents in our sample don't support the Democratic Party, the most popular answer is that they believe that the Democratic Party is too weak on illegal immigration. About 27% provide that response, followed by a belief that the Democratic Party is too influenced by the extreme left, is too focused on identity politics, pursues different economic policies than the ones I prefer. But if you flip the script and look at the reasons that respondents don't support the Republican Party, I was really struck that, the number one issue, there are actually two issues that are tied for one, each voiced by 18% of the sample. The first is that the Republican Party is intolerant of minorities. That's actually something that echoes what we found back in 2020. But tied at 18% is that the Republican Party does not support my views on abortion. So Sumitra, I mean, one of the things, and I don't know if you were struck by this, but abortion and reproductive rights kind of came up time and time again in a way that I think raises or exemplifies its salience in this election in ways that we just didn't see 4 years ago.
That's right. And that might be one of the reasons why women especially are moved to vote for the Democratic nominee this time around. Of course, we can't be entirely sure that that's what's entirely driving it. It could be anxieties that men have that are pushing them more towards the right. We can only speculate about the reasons why that's happening. We don't have a clear idea. One could say we have concepts of an idea. But you're right. 18% apiece report that the Republican Party is both intolerant of minorities and that it doesn't support respondents' views on reproductive rights. A small share after that say that the Republican Party is moving too much towards Christian evangelicalism. And while that's not a policy itself, the bunch of different answers that our respondents provide on this shows that there's more than one reason that makes them dissatisfied with the Republican Party. By contrast with the Democrats, a quarter of people say that it's weak on the question of illegal immigration and that's its biggest liability. But with the Republican Party, there's a bunch of different answers that people provide. So you could take this to mean that there's a bunch of different fronts, more than two, on which the Republican Party potentially needs to change in order to woo this community. And I think that's interesting because I think the Republican Party sees Indian Americans having their natural home with the Republican Party. I'm sure you both saw that Trump tweeted just a few days back, wishing Indian Americans a happy Diwali in a tweet that was filled with a bunch of other things. So I assume the Diwali message and the pro-Hindu message got lost in the noise. But I do think the Republican Party sees that Indian America or thinks that Indian Americans belong with them. And here's a snapshot about perhaps why they don't. And it's not one reason, it's a bunch of different reasons.
So, Devesh, something that you said earlier and that we discussed already is that, as we were putting this report together, we discussed this notion that, people who belong to the kind of scholarly or analyst class need to rethink their assumptions about voting behavior of visible minorities, immigrant communities. And if we just take one specific example, right, and I'd love for you to just elaborate on this, there's a general impression, right, amongst the general public that it is white voters that are the most concerned about illegal immigration. But it turns out, right, so are immigrants, whether they be Indian Americans or Hispanics. And I'm wondering if you think that this fact should sound the alarm bells for the Democratic Party.
I think very much so. I think many of the immigrants who have come have the vast majority, and that's particularly the case with Indian Americans, have come through authorized channels, right? They're legal immigrants. And as we all know, that entails a whole, you have to jump through multiple hoops. And I think there is a sense that the Democratic Party cares less about people who dutifully stand in the line and to await their turn. They do try and fulfill everything that's required to meet the requirements of legal immigration. And in contrast, seem to focus so much of their attention on illegal immigrants. Now, the very good reasons, of course, for spending energy on illegal immigrants, because many of them are coming from places racked by conflict and so on. But I think in general, we know that from surveys, the American population at large has relatively much more favorable views of legal immigrants than of illegal immigrants. And that, I think, has just to do with the fact about some adherence to rule of law, right? You can agree or disagree, but that's the general, I think, thing. And I think Indian American immigrants, as Hispanic immigrants, feel that they stood in the line for so long, and the Democrats don't seem to value that to the degree they seem to spend their energy focusing on how to improve things for illegal sort of immigrants.
So, just to kind of wrap things up, let me pose a question to both of you. And Sumitra, maybe I'll start with you, which is, when we do a survey like this, when anyone does a survey like this, which is a kind of snapshot in time, it inevitably raises as many questions as it answers. And as you think about the future, what questions or issues are kind of top of mind for you in terms of where you might like to dig a little bit deeper or try and understand dynamics a little bit better?
Great question. So I think first off, I'm really curious about the shift towards the Republican Party that we're seeing among Indian Americans. But I want to know, is this a permanent trend? And if so, why? Our data doesn't really let us dig into the why, but that's exactly what I want to understand. It's possible that it is actually driven by policy issues like we've discussed, or it's possible that it's just more of a general partisan shift, right? There's this classic political science theory by Aiken and Bartels, which suggests that people vote more based on identity and group loyalty rather than on specific policies and ideologies. So is this shift among Indian Americans about a deeper identification with what the party stands for, not in terms of policies, but as social identity? Or is it actually about the issues? That's something that I would like to get into. There's also another angle that we've discussed on this. The three of us before have talked about it, about status changes, right? So going from a majority in India to a minority here in the US, it's possible that that shift impacts political leanings. Political scientist Diana Mutz, for example, found in 2016 that the sort of perceived threats to the majority status of white Americans drove many of them to vote for Trump. Could something similar be happening here, perhaps? And that's, I think, a whole layer that I would love to explore a little bit more. Second, and more personally, because I work on misinformation, I think I'm just really interested in understanding misinformation within the Indian American community. Do they fall for the same myths and conspiracies that we see in the general population? Do they believe hurricanes are somehow caused by the government, or that immigrants are responsible for really wild things like eating our cats and dogs? Or, and I think this is important, is the community's unique profile, like we've discussed, in terms of their higher levels of education and income in some way protecting or shielding them from some of these community conspiracy theories, or is it making them more vulnerable? And I think that's a big question, because understanding it could really shape how we approach not just our understanding of misinformation, but also partisan messaging in elections to come in more diverse communities, which is a topic I work on during most of my time and that I'm interested in.
Devesh, what about you? What is it that jumps out, knowing what we know now, having analyzed at least one part of the survey? What is it that jumps out at you as something you'd like to explore further, or questions that arise?
I think one sort of following up on Sumitra's she evoked the work of Diana Mutz about white Americans, the status threat and moving to the right. But then Indian Americans, if you perceive a status threat moving from the majority to the minority here, have done exactly the opposite. They've moved more to the left. So if it is an issue of status threat, why do some groups move to the right and some to the left? Or is it that the status threat is much more among some subgroups rather than, because we saw that for women, maybe it is a policy issue like abortion rather than a status threat. The second question, I think, to me is about identities. We all know that everyone has multiple identities. And the sense one got from our survey was that immigrants, for them, the most salient identity is ethnicity, because they come from India, they have a stronger sense of their Indian identity. But those born in the US, who see themselves as more American, obviously, that's where we see the gender gap. And so the identity that seems to be more salient and driving their behavior is their gender identity rather than their ethnic identity. That's, of course, a sense one gets from this, and it would be nice to really tease it out, whether the identity that is salient shifts across generations and across immigrant cohorts.
My guests on the show this week are Sumitra Badrinathan and Devesh Kapur. Sumitra is an assistant professor of political science at the Department of Politics, Governance, and Economics at American University's School of International Service. Devesh is the Starr Foundation Professor of South Asian Studies at Johns Hopkins-SAIS. The three of us are, together, authors of a new report published by the Carnegie Endowment titled Indian Americans at the Ballot Box, Results from the 2024 Indian American Attitude Survey. Sumitra, Devesh, this was a sprint to get this out before the election, but I think there's a lot of fodder in here for the research. Happy Election Day to you both, and thanks again for doing this.
Thanks, Milan, for having us.
Thanks for having us. I'm off to watch 17 hours of Steve Kornacki.
Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grand Tamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, grandtamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.